Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Howard Bloom, who has been called the Einstein, Newton, and Freud of the 21st century. Howard Bloom, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Howard, will cover promoting people, selling really big ideas, the West, and the future of humanity. I guess I wanted to start with just a little bit more of your background so that our audience knows who we are conversing with here.
Okay, well, I started in science at the age of 10. I started in microbiology and theoretical physics. I started accumulating really minor credentials when I was 12. My goodness, this phone. Now, let's figure out how to do this. Okay, so I started to accumulate minor credentials when I was 12 years old. I built my first Boolean algebra machine. I co-designed a computer that won some science fair awards. I was taken for a meeting with the head of the graduate physics department at my local university, the University of Buffalo. I'm sure it was supposed to be a 5-minute courtesy visit. It turned into an hour because the biggest issue that year, 1955, was steady state theory of the universe versus Big Bang theory of the universe. And that was the year when the major proponent of steady state theory knew with absolute precision he would destroy Big Bang theory and no one would ever hear of it again. So we spent an hour discussing the interpretation of the Doppler shift and its implication for these two different theories. And he came out and put his hand on my shoulder and said to my mom, "You don't have to stay for grad school for him. He'll get fellowships in theoretical physics anywhere he wants."
This is about what time period?
That was 1950. I got turned on to books and started reading 2 books a day in 1953 at the age of 10. And by the time I hit the age of 12, God knows how many books I had read. I was also tutored in outside-the-box math by the head of research and development for the company that made the valves for the first plane to break the sound barrier and the first plane to take humans to the edge of space. So that's me. That's my background. It's been science. And I've been on the trail of the gods inside of us, the deepest passions inside of us, since I was 12 years old. And because I'm a total science person, and because to me, science means the aspiration to omniscience, the aspiration to know everything. The fact that there are mysteries like the ecstatic experience, and the transcendent experience, that to me is a vital part of science. If science can't crack that, it's not science yet. So I started my pursuit of that, as I said, at the age of 12. And I had no reason to be in popular culture at all, because that was the culture of the kids who used to beat me up. I listened to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, and Stravinsky. And but after I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa from NYU, with indeed 4 fellowships in what is now called cognitive neuroscience, I turned them down. And instead I went into popular culture. Why? Because if I regarded grad school as Auschwitz for the mind. Here I was fascinated by the ecstatic experience. And yet, if I were to go to grad school, I would spend the rest of my life giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students at a time in exchange for a college credit. And John, how many ecstatic experiences are you going to see in that room when those students are filling out their paper and pencil tests?
I guess one, when class is dismissed.
Yes, exactly. And so I ended up, by a series of accidents in rock and roll, and I ended up founding the biggest PR firm in the rock industry. and worked with, see if you've heard of these people. I worked with Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Aerosmith, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, Run DMC, Kool and the Gang, Shaka Khan, people like that.
My goodness. Well, thank you for that recap, and I realized that was just like hitting some of the wave tops. But I would love to get your perspective as a promoter. So this podcast and the Information Professionals Association is all about understanding the way people get influenced.
Right.
And you, as a promoter, I would think that influence was part of the job description. How did you approach the notion of influence when you were promoting someone? And by the way, I'd love, if you don't mind, Howard, if you could recap the story that you told about your engagements with Prince, and I'll put a link to this video. You tell a really touching story about Prince, and I think it was on the occasion of his death. But anyway, do you think you could talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. First off, words like information professionals, or the group I belong to, the Foundations of Information Science Group. And the word cognitive, or the Cognitive Crucible, all of these words are misleading because they speak about data as if it's a dry and lifeless thing. But it's not a dry and lifeless thing, especially if you want to be an influencer. If you want to be an influencer, there are two giant words that don't appear in these disciplines, and they are truth and soul. And without those two things, you cannot sell. Without those two things, you cannot influence. It was my understanding, look, the first rules of science that I learned at the age of 10, the rules that won me over to science as my religion for the rest of my life, were the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And the book in my lap gave the example of Galileo and told the tale all wrong, but it didn't matter. And look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And those are the primary rules of journalism as well as science. So when I accidentally tripped into rock and roll, truth and soul meant everything to me. So if you were a journalist, what I was trying to give you was truth and soul. So, for example, I evolved a discipline. If you are a rock and roll artist, John, and you are due to turn in an album in 2 months' time, and you haven't written all the songs, you sit down in front of a blank computer screen at 2 p.m, and there are certain things you know with absolute conviction. The most important thing is that you can never write a lyric. You have no idea of how you ever have written a lyric. And by 4 p.m. on a reasonably good day, there's a lyric in front of you. My job is to find the gods inside of you that wrote that lyric. When you go on stage in front of a good audience, you see their pupils dilating, their eyes widening. You see their faces melting. You see them melting into one big amoeba of common energy. And you see that amoeba reach out a tunnel, a pseudopod to you. And the energy of that audience goes through you. You have an out-of-body experience. You're up on the ceiling watching this all happen. And up here somewhere, the energy of that audience gets utterly transmogrified and flows back down through the next movements of your body. And it's a continuous reverberating loop, a feedback loop. My job is to find the gods inside of you that danced you like a marionette for those 70 minutes on stage. And to accomplish that, I insist on spending 6 weeks studying you, building a picture of who you are from everything that's ever been written about you. and every
This
lyric
this
you've ever written.
this is the kind of thing that you would do with the artists that you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Right.
Okay.
I called it secular shamanism since it was going after the gods inside you.
What I'm sorry, what did you call it again?
Secular shamanism.
Okay. All right. Great. Yeah.
And then after that 6 weeks of study, I insisted on coming out to see you in your own environment without any wives, any managers, any assistants, any intercessors, nobody but you and me in the room. Because my job was to go soul spelunking, to dive into the caves of your emotions and find out who you really are, who is really dancing you on stage. So an example of that was Prince. And I had gotten into the habit of reading all 3 trade magazines in the music industry first thing Monday morning, from cover to cover, every word.
This was
And
like Rolling Stone. What
no,
else?
it was in those days, it was Billboard, Cashbox, and Record World.
Ah, okay.
2 of which don't exist anymore.
Okay.
And I noticed a strange thing happening on the R&B charts, the black charts. There was an artist I'd never heard of, and he was rising into the top 20 on the charts. And then something even stranger happened. This artist I'd never heard of went platinum. That never happens. That just doesn't happen, that an artist no one has ever heard of goes platinum. So I became intensely curious about this guy. And I was working with Earth, Wind, and Fire. And Earth, Wind, and Fire's manager was named Bob Cavallo, and he's a genius. And Bob called one day and said, I have this new artist. Would you like to work with him? And it turned out to be the artist that I had been tracking on the charts. And his name was Prince. So, of course, I said yes with enormous eagerness. I did my 6 weeks of homework on Prince. In his case, reading the lyrics was quite a shocking experience. He was just about to promote his album, Dirty Minds. And there's all kinds of stuff in there that you never see in music lyrics. And then they flew me up to Buffalo, New York, which ironically is my hometown, not Prince's hometown. But he had taken over a theater I'd gone to see a film in when I was 11 years old, the Shea Theater, and was using it to rehearse the Dirty Minds tour. Now, meantime, I got a call from Warner Brothers West Coast office, and that was his record label. And the people at Warner's were absolutely top notch. And one of these really good publicists said, you know, you can't work with Prince. You know that, don't you? And I said, no. And she said, and I said, why? And she said, we set him up for 2 interviews. He didn't even talk to the first interviewer at all, not a word. And then he tried to strangle the second interviewer. And here I'd laid down my conditions. I was going to need to spend a day with Prince in his environment. So I went to the Shea Theater. I sat in the empty audience zone while the group rehearsed. And then at 1 o'clock in the morning, they finished. And Prince and I went looking for a room backstage whose door we could lock. We found one. We locked ourselves in. And I got the story of Prince's life. And what you're really looking for when you're trying to find the gods within is imprinting points, moments when something happened that will continue to shape that artist's brain and his passions for the rest of his life. And I found one when Prince was 5 years old. When Prince was 5 years old, his dad was a jazz musician. His mother took him to see a rehearsal of his dad's band. Prince walked into an empty theater, very much like the Shea Theater we were sitting in. And there at the center of the stage, with the spotlight on him, was his dad. And Prince said behind his dad were 5 of the most beautiful women he'd ever seen in his life. Now, imprinting moments for music often combine huge amounts of attention, like the audience screaming so loud at the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show that you can't hear the music, and huge charges of sexuality. In the Beatles' case, on the Ed Sullivan Show, girls fainting and screaming in the audience. In this case, the 5 most beautiful women Prince had ever seen in his life. And that was it.
When Prince was telling you about this, what you said he was about how old?
Prince would have been somewhere between 19 and 23.
Early adulthood.
Yeah, very early adulthood.
Gotcha.
And then another imprinting moment came when he was in the junior high school and high school. His best friend, Andre Simone's mother, had a finished basement, and it wasn't used for anything. So Prince started an alternative society in this basement. He founded his own chosen people in this basement. And his rules were the rules that my group, the hippies, were functioning by in the early 1960s. Make love, not war. So Prince felt that with sexuality, you could eradicate violence. And so there was a lot of sex going on in that basement, and it was an alternative society in which Prince was the founder and the prophet. And those were his two major imprinting points as I saw them. So if you were a press person, my job was not to try to please you with some artificial treat. My job was to give you a soul deep truth. It was ultimately to give you these stories about Prince and prove to you that Prince was worth covering and that you, a journalist, could write a good story about him.
How did you take those two imprinting stories and talk to a member of the press in a way that imparts those stories, but presumably you had to condense it down a little bit.
You have to get it down to 180 words
right.
or less.
Yeah.
And I don't remember exactly how I went about doing it in those days because I was accumulating a lot of other information, like Prince's track record. Those platinum albums, for example, would get your attention if you were a journalist. And I tried to put in as many awards and praises as I could in the first 90 words. And then the fact that there was a soul deep truth in this artist at the end. And the ultimate example was John Mellencamp, because the press hated, loathed, and despised John Mellencamp. They felt they knew his personality, and his personality was hideous and ghastly. And they felt they knew his music, which was also hideous and ghastly. So a friend of mine, Ken Emerson, who at that point was the lead reviewer for Rolling Stone, he was the reviews editor, which means he assigned all of the reviews, got in a new John Mellencamp album, never opened the wrapping, never opened it at all, and wrote a review about it, which is outrageous because, remember, the first commitment of scientists and journalists is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. So with John Mellencamp, they really didn't want to hear the positives on John Mellencamp for me. I went out to Indiana. I slept in a bedroom in his house. We spent a day alone in his living room. His wife wasn't allowed anywhere near the room. His managers were not there. I went through the story of John's life with him, looking for these imprinting points, found stories that were absolutely astonishing. I found one of the most genuine groups of stories of going through a teenagehood and somehow surviving it with difficulty that you've ever heard in your life. And I came back and sat down each of the key people in the press. By key people, I mean, if you're influencing, you have to be aware of the fact that there's a hierarchy of influencers. And there's generally a lead sheep. Once upon a time in 1832, Carlyle, the British social commentator, talked about a friend of his in Germany who was also a writer, who'd been in the middle of a field one Sunday, and he saw a herd of 2,000 sheep coming down. You know those little narrow passages between the poplar trees that are so narrow that if you make the mistake of taking your date out there and trying to walk the path, you have to walk in single file, so you have to hold your hand behind you?
I've got a visual.
Okay, so that's because sheep, when they are traveling, travel in single file. So this friend of Carlyle's went to the path, stuck out his cane before the first sheep could arrive, and the first sheep jumped over it. Then he withdrew his cane, and guess what happened with all the 1,999 other sheep? They all jumped too. Yes, at that point, even though there was no longer anything to jump over. So if you were an influencer, your job is to find the lead sheep. And your job is to become friends with them. And I don't mean artificial friends, I mean real friends, because remember, your career at least if you do it my way, is based on truth and soul. And people in the press appreciate that tremendously. So my first task was to sit down each of these key influencers for lunch. Why lunch? Because if I have you at lunch, I can talk to you for 3 hours straight. The incredible Italian restaurant at the base of the building in which I had my offices, the owner was extremely friendly to me. He treated me as if he were my father. And we could stay there when all the other guests had gone, when they were setting up the tables for dinner. He let me stick around, and I could tell these stories of John Mellencamp. For the first year, it seemed to have no effect whatsoever. For the second year, it seemed to have no effect whatsoever. Then John came into Manhattan and performed at the Radio City Music Hall. And we had all the press people that I'd been taking to lunch there. And John, like Prince and John Mellencamp are two of the most extraordinary performers you will ever see in your life. So when the performance is over, the record company held a party in a huge downstairs red velvet walled room. And each of the people I'd taken for lunch came up to me one by one and grabbed me by my forearms and looked me into the eye from this distance and said, "You were right. You were right." And from that moment on, John started getting magazine covers.
My goodness.
So this is something I call perceptual turnaround. But what are its basic ingredients? Not big data, not information science, even though I've been published in information science at this point, but truth and soul.
My goodness. Well, those are some fantastic stories, and there's so many things that I want to follow up and ask you about. Let me just tick off the kinds of things that are in my mind right now. And we can like put placeholders on some of them and maybe come back to them. So, number one, I was struck as you were talking probably about 5 minutes ago now, but you mentioned you talked about this in a very poetic way. It seems to me like you had phrases such as like finding the God within, secular shamanism, soul spelunking, the caves of your emotions. You know, all of that together puts this into a bit of like a spiritual dimension, not religious, but spiritual. And one of the people I've mentioned this on the podcast several times, but one of the teachers who I have really appreciated the way he put things. You may have heard of this gentleman, Joseph Campbell.
Oh yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
Very
so
important.
I would love to get your take on Joseph Campbell and myth and all that kind of stuff. So that's like one thing. Separately, but related, of course, is you're talking about finding the lead sheep. And if you can find the lead sheep, then others will tend to follow. And I'm curious to get your comment about like today's influencers or just marketing in general. Like you try to find a really big celebrity or the lead sheep, right, to try to sell products. It could be basketball shoes. It could be Old Spice deodorant. It could be anything, right? You try to find somebody who is relatively not always, but frequently you try to find some kind of a celebrity lead sheep in order to help sell products. And I think that might align with some of the stuff that you were talking about. And then finally, I want to start, projecting this same conversation into some of your current project work about space and the future of humanity. But anyway, if maybe we could start with your how you think this aligns with some of the things that Joseph Campbell used to teach.
Well, when I went into popular culture, my goal was to enter the dark underbelly where new myths and movements are made. And it was only about 2 years ago that I realized something, which is that my real job, if you were Prince, my real job was to make you iconic, was to turn you into an icon. My real job was to take the story of your life and present it so that a kid who, at the age of 12, when his hormones are just beginning to get going, who pastes a poster of you up on his wall, his bedroom wall, that kid is adopting you as a role model for his life. And that's why I had to make sure that truth and soul were primary, because it was with truth and soul. Look, when you confess, all of us at the age of 12 and a half, when the hormones hit, think we're insane. We all have these deep emotions for which we have no words. And we are sure that nobody has them but us, and that if anybody else knew about them, we'd be thrown out of polite society and even impolite society. And then along comes an articulator, a person like Prince, or like Michael Jackson, or like Bob Marley. And that person puts not just words to how we feel, but also puts a stance to how we feel. It's the way he or she stands on stage that comes to mean everything to us. But it makes us realize that we are not isolated and alone, that we are part of a movement, that there are hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of millions of other people who feel the way that we do. And that is a vital part of human society, to create mythic figures who can become the trellises, if you know a trellis from growing tomato plants. My job is, if there's something genuine in you and it's expressing itself through your art, to reveal who that something is so you can become a trellis on which a new generation can grow. You can become the symbol that allows these people to recognize that they are not crazy, they are not alone, they are part of a movement.
Something that Joseph Campbell mentioned that really stuck with me is, for those in our audience who are less familiar with him, he was a he was a comparative religious scholar who was most active, I think, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, that maybe time period, maybe in the 1940s as well. But he wrote several really famous books. But he was an expert on myths. Of course, you can't talk about myths without also getting into religion. But he said that we, the collective we, need like new stories or new myths in order to satisfy this human experience. And so I'd love, Howard, for you to start talking about the kind of thing that you're promoting and socializing, I think, which could actually ultimately wind up becoming like a new kind of a myth for mankind in its pursuits.
Well, celebrities, if they are simply sold to us, marketed to us, mean very little. But celebrities,
I guess kind of like I was just describing a moment ago, right?
right?
Celebrities who are selling a product.
But if celebrities are there to sell who they and what they really are at their most intense core, then they're mythic figures. In 2005, I had been persuaded with great difficulty to come to my first space conference. It was a friend from the National Science Foundation and a friend from NASA and a bunch of other people who were really piling it on and getting me out there. Well, I saw someone speak who said, when I got out of school, I asked what three things would do the most in my lifetime to change the nature of humanity. And those three things were the internet, alternative energy, and space. And some alarm bell in my gut went off and said, you are watching a mythic figure. This is a person on whom kids 115 years from now are going to be basing their lives. And even though this guy was ridiculed by NASA, he had not even launched a tin can with a firecracker in it. I had 4 phone calls with him, and I couldn't tell him why I was calling. And it was because the myth the mythic alarm was going off, but it would take me 10 years of processing to figure that out. There are some people who are myths in the making. If no one ever reveals that mythic nature, then humanity is deprived of something. For example, Michael Jackson broke the bounds of normal human awe, wonder, and surprise. If you I stood next to Michael Jackson at a pool table in his brother Merlin's pool house, which is a little house with big enough for one floor, one room on the first floor and one room on the second floor. His brothers were surrounding us, and the art director from CBS Records was in the room. They needed to decide on an artist to do their next album cover. And the art director slid the first portfolio across the table, and Michael turned the page only enough to see a square inch. And he went, ooh, 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 ooh. Michael Jackson was having a full-scale aesthetic orgasm, and with his left elbow against my right elbow, his left shoulder against my right shoulder, and his left knee against my right knee, so that every motion his body made was conveyed directly to me. And I had never seen such a quality of awe, wonder, and surprise in my life. Well, what is the second law of science? Look at things right under your noses if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Michael Jackson was the living incarnation of that law of awe, wonder, and surprise. And Michael Jackson's ability to see the infinite in the tiniest of things was so amazingly intense that I felt it set a new standard. It pushed the boundaries open of human possibility. It inched them out. In fact, in my book, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul and the Power Bits of Rock and Roll, I talk about the fact that in 1954, every sports physiologist knew with absolute certainty that humans could not break the 4-minute mile. And then along came a medical student named Roger Bannister, who with another medical student analyzed every move he made when he was running and figured out how to get rid of every single move that was losing him energy. And Roger Bannister finally did the impossible. He broke the 4-minute mile. And since then, 1,600 people have broken the 4-minute mile, because what Roger Bannister really did is he opened the envelope of human possibility. And in the same way that Roger Bannister opened that envelope, I feel Michael Jackson opened that envelope. But if you get the time, read the stories of Michael Jackson and Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, and you'll really get a gut sense of what I'm talking about. And you have to get a gut sense of it in order to be part of it, in order to be part of moving the boundaries, the limits of human possibility out just a little bit.
Right.
And this is the role of myth. This is the role of myth. What was Gilgamesh all about? Creating impossible things as a warrior, and creating impossible adventures. In other words, defining a standard by which you could measure yourself, defining a role model that you could use as you grew. And this is what Michael Jackson, Bob Marley, and Prince have done. You know, I was taken out of action for 15 years by a very serious illness. I was locked in a bedroom, and for 5 years was too weak to talk, and too weak to have another person in the room with me. And during that time, I finally discovered my only option was to go on the internet, which was still very new at the time, and be a cyber person, since I couldn't be a person in the real world. But, and I wrote 3 books, and I founded 2 international scientific groups. But aside from that, when I finally got out in 2003, I was scared to death that no one would remember my clients, especially Michael Jackson and Prince. And I walked into a local cafe called the Tea Lounge, where I started to work. And everybody I talked to, no matter what age, not only remembered Michael Jackson and Prince, but tried to express to me what a vital role they had played in these people's formation, in these people's lives, and what a vital role they still play today. Well, this is the realm of myth. And these are the myths of our lifetime. But there's been nobody since I left the business, maybe this is my ego talking, but to the best of my knowledge, there has been no one in the industry who focuses on soul and truth since then. And the goal of managers has not been to get across raw soul. The goal of managers has been to get as many ginger ale tie-ins for huge sums, for $1 million or more, as they can. Well, those ginger ale tie-ins and soap tie-ins and God knows what else, those are diminishing the value of the artist as a sturdy lamppost of soul, as someone you could use to guide your own growth and development. So the people who are in charge of celebrity today don't know what myth is all about. They don't know that myth is about a truth more powerful than truth. There's a concept you have to know. It's supernormal stimuli. Nico Tinbergen in the 1940s was experimenting. He was observing seagulls off the coast of Scandinavia. And he noticed that the seagulls have a very flat nest. It has very short walls. And so when a seagull comes in from hunting all day out in the ocean and settles down on her eggs, she sometimes knocks an egg out of the nest. And then Nico Tinbergen noticed as she reached out her beak past the edge of the nest and grabbed the egg with her beak and tried to imagine moving an egg with a screwdriver, and tried, scooped and scooped and scooped until she finally got the egg back into the nest. And Nico Tinbergen said, I bet this is a reflex, like your knee reflex when you hit it with a hammer. And now I want to find the trigger to that reflex. So he started making artificial eggs and looking for the characteristics of the egg that trigger this response the most intensely. And he found that if you made an egg slightly larger and a slightly different color, and even if you put polka dots on it, even if you made it the size of a basketball, he could make an egg that was more appealing than the real egg. So that if you put the real egg next to the artificial egg, the mother would scoop in the artificial egg, not the real egg. Myth is about supernormal stimuli. The myth of Gilgamesh is a supernormal, it's a human being built to fit into our instincts, into our emotions, to trigger our emotions. And we have those in modern society. They are the people who become celebrities. And one of the other things I discovered when I asked around at the tea lounge and discovered that everybody there had a story to tell about the role of Michael Jackson and Prince.
Yeah.
But this is myth. This is where new myth and movements are made.
Well, so how do you take those experiences, those things that you learned about not only the people that who you promoted, but how the rest of society would respond to those people as well, who you said you were trying to make them icons? How do you take that experience and infuse it into your current projects? Like, for example, I know that you are very passionate about the Western project in general, and you're also very passionate about the potential for humans to become a spacefaring civilization.
Right. So how do I take these forward? There's a new thing called the Howard Bloom Institute. It has two major initiatives. One is omnology, and that's a scientific discipline for the promiscuously curious. It means follow all your curiosities simultaneously. Do not let people stovepipe you into one narrow specialization. Take advantage of the fact that you fly over the face of a bunch of specializations, so that when all your friends are turning 40 and having midlife crises, and the women are planning elaborate divorces to find out who they really are, and the men are buying little red sports cars and picking up blondes and cheating on their wives because they have no idea of why they're here on Earth, you will just be returning from the desert.
What was that word that you just used a moment ago? Is that an actual word or is that something you made up?
Oh, omnology?
That, yes. What is that
Yes,
word again?
omnology. Yes, I made that up. It's the aspiration to omniscience.
Oh, omnology. Okay, got it.
Right.
Okay, okay.
So you will just be coming back from the realm of your multiple curiosities with your first answers. And while your friends feel they're at the end of their lives, you will know that you're at the beginning of yours. That's omnology. And the second initiative is Why Save Western Civilization? And there are a bunch of facts that none of us really seem to know, but are extraordinarily important. Every civilization that calls on our idealism says that it will lift the poor and the oppressed. The Western system has done this more effectively than any other system on planet Earth. If you've been born in the Western system in 2000, your odds, your life expectancy would have been twice what your life expectancy would have been in 1850. We've added an extra 40 years to the human lifespan. If you had been the poorest paid worker in London in 2000, you would have earned what an entire tenement full of the poorest paid workers earned in 1850. If you had been born anywhere in the Western world, or let's put this differently, the Stanford Binet IQ test was introduced in 1916. If we gave that test they used the first year, to 100 kids today who allegedly have been dumbed down and shallowed by the internet, they would measure as marginal geniuses. We've added 35 points to the average IQ. And most important of all, we have increased the peace in the world by a factor of 10, despite 2 bloody world wars and a whole bunch of minor wars in the 20th century. And God knows what will happen with the war in the Ukraine. If you've been born into one of those lovely indigenous tribes that lives in harmony with nature and at peace with its fellow man, your odds of dying a violent death at the hands of a fellow human being would have been 10 times what they are in New York City or Portland, Oregon. If you've been born into Western civilization in 1650, before the great humanist revolution began, your odds of dying a violent death would have been 10 times what they are today.
Nasty, brutish, and short, like Thomas Hobbes would say, right?
Yes. So if our great-great-grandparents could give us an extra 40 years of life, surely we owe an extra 40 years of life to our great-great-grandkids. If our great-great-grandparents could increase the minimum wage by a factor of 7, surely we can take the $10 minimum wage and increase it to $70 for our great-great-grandkids. And if our great-great-grandparents could increase the peace in the world by a factor of 10, surely we owe another factor of 10 to our great-great-grandkids. But to achieve that, we have to know the magic of the Western system. The Western system consists of 3 elements contending against each other and creating a dynamic balance. And those 3 elements are government, private industry, and the protest industry. And without any of those, you fail. For example, Deng Xiaoping in 1980 picked up private industry from the Western system and decided to plant it in China. And he said, let them get rich. And private industry had been, until the last 2 years, the root of China's explosive economic growth, a growth that means that China, if it kept growing, would outpace the United States, the American economy, by 2030. But Deng Xiaoping, or Xi Jinping, sorry, the leader for the last 10 years, has taken a different approach. He's been cutting private industry off at the knees. He has been taking people, accusing them of corruption, putting them in jail. He's been taking one of the 2 most famous men in China. The other man who was as famous as Xi Jinping was Jack Ma. And Jack Ma had Alibaba, and Alibaba had revolutionary payment solutions and all kinds of cyber solutions, and was appearing at conferences all over the world, was making it on the cover of magazines, and Deng Xiaoping cut him off at the knees. And now you don't hear from Jack Ma anymore. And he cut Jack Ma's connection. He cut the vital creative connection between Jack Ma and his company that was creating new products constantly. And the result of doing this to thousands of companies, not just Jack Ma, is that the Chinese rate of growth was 9 to 10% for the last 10 years. Now it's 2.5% because Xi Jinping is killing the economy. He's taking the one element of the Western system out.
Yeah.
And he hasn't had the protest industry because there is rigid totalitarian control over what you can discuss and what you can say in China. So the odds are, if this Xi Jinping imposed economic stall continues, that the growth in China is going to continue and China will not become the biggest economy in the world.
There's an interesting historical comparison point here. And I brought this up on one of our episodes quite some time ago, and I'll put a link in the show notes with a gentleman named Tom Sear. But we started talking a bit about China and its technological trajectory. But in that episode, I asked him for his take on this, and I'll ask the same of you, Howard. So it's back in the late 1400s, maybe that time period, there was a Chinese captain,
Right.
naval captain,
Roughly 1410 or 1415.
Is that right? Anyway, yeah, I forget the gentleman's name. I'll put a link in the show notes. Very famous, but this fellow and his crews, they were sailing all over the place. I think they have documentation that he was in Africa, and anyway, but shortly after this captain's success, the Chinese emperor at the time, made a decision, which I think a lot of historians point to this moment as the moment where China, turned away from the Enlightenment type of trajectory that the world was just embarking on in the 1400s and on into the 1500s, turned away and basically said, we're not going to be doing this. Our destiny is within, and et cetera. And they turned away from the outside world.
Right.
And so there's an interesting analog here,
right,
today. So if you go back to like the 1970s and Nixon and the opening of China and détente and whatnot, that potentially, I mean, all of this is, this is kind of fuzzy, but potentially, that kind of started the Chinese economic success that they have enjoyed all the way until very recently here. And so now, if China is deciding once again to turn away from Western technologies or from globalism and all that kind of stuff, and they're pursuing their own agenda, there could be the same kind of a dynamic playing out again, except in the 21st century. What's your take on all that?
Xi Jinping has a take on this, the current leader of China. And he feels that when China destroyed all of the ships, these are ships the size of apartment buildings, ships far bigger than any of the Europeans had at the time.
This is in the 1400s.
This is the Admiral's expeditionary fleet, which traveled a total of 3,000 miles outside of China.
Yeah.
So when the emperor scrapped those ships and stopped that exploration program, he killed the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping is the one who feels this. So it is his obligation to make sure that China does not turn its back on the next great ocean. And what does Xi Jinping see as the next great ocean? Space.
Yeah.
And he plans to have the Han, the central people of China, he plans to have Chinese ownership of the solar system by, God knows, probably 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the original Mao's Chinese Revolution. He also, as absurd as this sounds, talks about having the Chinese populating the stars.
I don't think that sounds absurd at all.
Well, he's got a space program, and the difficulty for him is this: America continues to lead. America continues to lead in space, not thanks to NASA, which is bogged down like a dinosaur, but thanks to an immigrant from South Africa, Elon Musk. And Elon Musk has got something under development he calls the Starship. And it is a spaceship big enough to carry 100 people at a time and capable of landing on the moon or Mars, then taking off again and coming back to Earth, capable of being refueled. NASA is trying to get off the ground this vehicle that will take 3 people into space, that will cost $4.1 billion to launch, and that will not be able to land on the surface of the moon. And it's allegedly a moon mission that NASA is undertaking. For the $4.1 billion to launch one of NASA's Space Launch System rockets, you could buy launches of 2,000 of Elon Musk's Starships. You could transport a total, I have to recheck the arithmetic, but roughly 1 million people to space for the price of one Space Launch System rocket. One reason is because the Space Launch System rocket is made to be thrown away. It's an incredibly expensive rocket you can only use one time. Elon's Starships are designed to be reusable, like buses and trains. You don't throw those away as soon as they've had their first use. You keep them around for the next 40 years. And that's what Elon intends to do with the Starship. So thanks to an immigrant, not thanks to MAGA, Make America Great Again, which is about shutting ourselves off the way that the Chinese emperor shut China off in 1410, but by being open to an outsider from South Africa, for example. We've been able to outpace the Chinese so dramatically that when they show their latest plans for a rocket, which they did in the last week, their latest plan for a rocket is a knockoff of the Starship. So they're way behind if we choose to remain ahead. But it's very possible that we may not choose to move ahead because resentment for the super rich has become such a religion. And it's specifically resentment against Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Well, look, we've just been through a massive pandemic. We've all been through massive lockdowns. How did we make it through? One of the things that allowed us to make it through was deliveries from Amazon. We could get absolutely anything delivered to our home in a short amount of time by Amazon. That's Jeff Bezos' gift to humanity. Jeff Bezos pushed open the envelope of human possibility the way that Michael Jackson did on the wonder and awe front. And Elon, what is Elon doing? We've all been bellyaching about a need for a green economy. And we all know that part of that need is the need to switch from gasoline-driven cars to electric cars. Elon is the greatest electric car maker in the world. He's doing this for us without claiming he's doing it for us. And then when it comes to space, I mean, look, life is very ambitious. Life could not have survived 3.85 billion years ago without being outrageously ambitious. Why? Because it took tenacity. The seas were boiling. The seas had acids that could destroy just about anything you can find. There were still planetesimals, meteors, smacking themselves into the face of the planet periodically. Volcanoes were belching all over the place. It was an incredibly hostile environment. And for life to not only take hold, but to expand, it had to be imperialist and colonialist to the nth degree. It had to be constantly sending out new colonies and trying not just new places in which to live, but entirely new ways in which to live. So meantime, we feel that we have run out of resources on this planet. That is false. For every ounce of biomaterial on the planet, there are 100 million ounces of dead stuff just waiting to be kidnapped, seduced, and recruited into the process of life. And there's a bacteria that's disproving this notion that we're running out of resources. Right now, 12 miles beneath your feet and mine, these bacteria, chemolithoautotrophs, are turning raw rock into biostuff. They're kidnapping, seducing, and recruiting dead atoms and bringing them into the process of life. Now, bacteria are obviously capable of extraordinary research and development. We've been up against microorganisms research and development for the last 2 years with the COVID virus, which keeps coming up with new mutations at a very rapid rate. So we're not the only ones on the planet who can do research and development. What are we the only ones who can do? We're the only ones who can get life beyond the atmosphere. We're the only ones who can get life outside the gravity well. We're the only ones who can take life and plant it on other hostile balls of stone, like this ball of stone that, frankly, we've just begun to garden and green. Take a plane from New York to LA, and once you get, everything's green until you get to Pennsylvania. Once you get past Pennsylvania, everything is brown. Why? Because life hasn't figured out a way to successfully deal with it yet. Yes. So life is still in its infancy, even in taking over this ball of rock. But there are many other hostile balls of stone, poison pills of stone above our head, just waiting to be kidnapped, seduced, and recruited into the process of life. And we are the only ones who can take life to those hostile balls of stone.
I really do believe that space will help solve a lot of things that we consider problems today, including like global warming and like resource depletion. I get what you're saying, that we've barely begun to scratch the surface as far as the resources that Earth can still provide to us and the rest of the ecosystem. But in space, with the possibilities of mining asteroids, or manufacturing stuff in space, from space resources, and then importing that back to the Earth, I think will help solve a lot of problems. As well as I think I've heard you talk about harnessing energy in
Yes.
space, and bringing
Yes.
the energy down to Earth as well.
I put together Buzz Aldrin, the astronaut, and the 11th president of India, literally the most popular politician in South Asia, Dr. APJ Kalam, to do a space solar power initiative. And space solar power is the Green New Deal. Space solar power is the thing that will get us to net zero the fastest. Why? Because we can harvest solar power in space, and we can transmit it to Earth using the kind of harmless radio waves that your cell phone
Is that
uses.
right?
Yes, and we can get rid of all use of petrochemicals, all use of greenhouse spewing oil and its derivatives from the Earth, period. We can replace all of it.
What is the timeline on that? If you were just to swag it, like just a guess, any idea?
My guess is 30 to 40 years. The Chinese guess is 2035.
Is that right?
They plan to own space solar power by 2035. And they dedicated their first factory to nothing but space solar power modules 3 years ago.
Where did these operations take place? Is it like in low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, beyond?
I'm not a technical person. Yeah, I handle the vision side of things.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
But we've been working on the space solar power alternative as the Green New Deal, as the net zero bringer, for a long time. I mean, I was converted to it in roughly 1998 by my friend, a project manager at the National Science Foundation. And it's been such a clear and obvious solution. And when I met Elon Musk, the first thing that he said to me was, "I don't believe in space solar power." Well, that was 15 years before, or 17 years before Elon Musk developed the Starship. The Starship is on its way to its first orbital launch. We should see its next orbital launch somewhere in the next few months. Elon says the next successful orbital launch, the first one that doesn't blow up, is going to be anywhere from a month from now to a year from now. But once he gets that in the sky, that's going to bring the cost of taking cargo to space down so dramatically that space solar power becomes a whole different proposition than it was when Elon expressed his skepticism to me 17 years ago.
What else would you like to say, Howard, before we sign off?
Well, the most important thing is truth and soul. The most important thing is truth and soul. If you characterized me as sort of a natural salesman, Well, I'm only a natural salesman because I'm a speaking piece, a megaphone for truths that are inside of me. And I've spent my life pursuing those truths inside of me and in the outside world. And my motto used to be good information drives out bad. Now, I didn't know that I was getting this wrong. I got it from the principle in economics that says, that I thought said good money drives out bad. No, it says bad money drives out good. I didn't know that, thank God. Because in my career, truth trumped everything. Truth unlocks your passions. And if you want to influence people, influence them from your passions and your genuine beliefs and things that will be of value to humanity.
Wow. Well, that I think summarizes the reason why I wanted to ask you onto this podcast in the first place, Howard. Your passion shines through in a very inspiring way, and I was actually going to entitle this episode Howard Bloom on selling really big ideas, but I think I am going to change that to Howard Bloom on truth and soul instead. So
Terrific. I love it.
with that, Howard Bloom, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.